In many ways, I'm a designer, and I wanted to share some of the design challenges that I deal with in connecting my personality and strengths with the larger ecological and social environment. Um, the first thing is that on the communication continuum, I'm very high on long form. And so we're living in a short form culture of 20 and 30-second sound bites to 2 or 3 minutes. And my ideal conversation probably lasts around 3 hours. And so there's a big gap in both media and also relationships between a text type relationship and a 3 hour conversation. And I bridge that at present primarily through long form videos, where I'm able to engage with a technology that doesn't show anxiety and impatience, but rather when I look back at my own face in the dialogue, there's an interest, a curiosity, a play, and a comfort with the form. Next comes the value emphasis gap. As an American, I'm in a masculine oriented cult. And this is shown up in the rah-rah emphasis on leadership rather than following, on speaking rather than listening, on assertiveness rather than receptiveness, in making something of your life as to discovering the wonder in doing things and keeping busy as opposed to presence. And in each of these polarities, in a chauvinistic cult, the masculine is emphasized. And I think in part because of that, in part because I can be competently masculine and I know the limitations. I know you can make a lot of money and be well organized and be miserable, for example. The exterior being masculine, the interior being feminine. And I know that that's inefficient. I understand that ultimately we want to feel good and not feel bad, and that these feelings are guides, in a sense, towards coming back to balance, to symmetry, and towards integration. And I'm highly critical of our culture's obsession with the external and the masculine to the denigration and ignorance of the internal and the feminine. So in values, I also understand that balance is the key thing. So in a highly imbalanced masculine culture, I emphasize the feminine, which puts me up, in the 2% category of emphasis there. On the Zoom continuum, or the sensitivity continuum, or stimulation continuum, I'm high on sensitivity. Nuance tends to be very important, correlating with long form. My zoom lens, if I turn my attention to an individual, I have no attention or bandwidth for anyone else in the room. If I turn my attention to a topic, that topic is a consuming topic. I'm absorbing it with a zoom-in lens rather than a peripheral lens. This correlates with intensity, which puts me in various kind of sectors of relationship in the top 5%, 1 to 5% in intensity, too intense for many people. As a sensitive in that zoom-in lens, I'm then getting the message from a lot of people that what would make them happy is more space from me. And this is a difficult thing to absorb emotionally, because I'm tuning strongly into you in my comfort zone, and what I'm getting back is the message that what would make you happy is to have me further away, because our intensity continuums don't overlap. But it's not a preference that I regulate. Meaning, it's not in the analogy of the zoom-in lens as if I'm a photographer and I'm choosing the lens for the project. It's rather that I've got a zoom lens bolted into my body, and so to look out is to look out through a zoom-in lens. And there's not a lot of space in between. There's no space. That's me. That's my outlook. And so it's easy to take that intensity discrepancy personally. But it's also creates a kind of a tug of war to care about other people, and in doing so, almost wish not to exist, because some of my settings are, so far away from the comfort from the comfort zone of a large number of people, that I'm looking out and saying, how can I please you? How can I connect with you? And the response is, don't be yourself. And that's, a disconnect point. My response to the feminine is to spend most of my time on topics, often in a very masculine way, that advocate for a culture of more symmetry and balance. My response to this is to be very selective. Often I'll have one person in my life, sometimes two, but it often defaults to one, in a highly attuned relationship that is compatible. This creates a certain vulnerability, though, in those stages where I'm transitioning between one relationship and another relationship, given the universal need for love and belonging, and given the fact that I'm dealing with about 1% of the population is going to be a graceful fit for all of these metrics and at their different settings combined. We have an interesting expression here where parts of me are incredibly old and mature and sophisticated, and have always kind of exceeded my age, and other parts of me are very young and very innocent, and very sensible or sensitive, and even to a certain extent naive. And just wanting to make people happy, and wanting people to be happy with me, and expecting other people to want me to be happy. And that's it. That's what life is all about. And when that is damaged or traumatized or betrayed, it's an enormous shock to that very young part of me. That just says, I love you all. It's wonderful. I want to connect. I want to bring you joy. I want to bring you happiness. What are the problems? How can we solve them? You're important. And just assumes that everyone's thinking that way about me. And it's probably one of the biggest wounds, is that innocent part that is so happy to be in that state and so sad and bitter and miserable, the older parts of me, looking at the violations of that. And so there's kind of this narrow band in the middle, and and then there's these very kind of sophisticated, analytical, and perceptive, one could say wise, parts of me, and then these incredibly childlike and innocent feelings that are very easily offended or shocked, and it's like navigating the world from a 2-year-old's eyes. And so this age discrepancy is one of the separating proportions between me and a majority of the Western culture. My response to this is to travel to Thailand, where the childlike energy is far more at home, because this is a culture that smiles, that is empathic, that is feminine, that is playful, and that doesn't like to think too much. And that's, in ways, I would say the core part of me is that innocence that wants to love and be loved, and that knows that there's an abundance of connection, and knows the truth that there's enough love and enough resources for all, and knows that we need to gather the data, and then we can solve the problem about how to create survival and security and a sense of love and belonging for each human being. And as a more objective observer of this dynamic, I would say that the greatest tragedy of my life and of this culture is that that part of me is not recognized, or if it is recognized, is not prioritized, either in me or in the culture at large. Because truly I believe that the energy, the light that comes through that persona, each of us, being born with that persona, and then the culture grinding it out of us in many ways, I believe is some of the most powerful medicine for our species and our planet. And rather than elevating that, this part is systematically and somewhat cynically ignored and punished and undervalued and biased against at least 60% of the time. And there's a very, very, very small minority of cases in time where an individual is sophisticated enough in the understanding of the mathematics of innocence, the power of the fool. You see it in more ancient cultures. The fool is understood as the doorway into possibility, into the luminous unknown. But in more arrogant cultures, the fool is purely patronized and humiliated as the lower rung expression of the jester, as opposed to the transcendent fool. And that archetype is not honored in our culture. It's patronized, it's lectured, it is not seen as the doorway that it is. And this is perhaps the biggest aspect of my work, is to bridge the connection between this mature part and this innocent part through the mathematics of possibility, the mathematics of innocence, which in fact, as I deeply understand and know, it is more profitable, it is more healthy, there is lower threat, it is easier to honor the path of the fool, the path of the child, the path of that innocent one that seeks to love, than it is to behave in the sociopathic reptilian brain of the traumatized psyche induced by our culture. In other words, this hard-nosed business that says, we've got to put us first and this and that you actually lose more than you gain with that operating system. Meaning the mathematics are flawed in our culture. It's a delusion. And the delusion is being used to perpetuate misery at a very high price. It is not a sustainable or shrewd or sophisticated model. So it's backwards, in other words. Our culture knocks us out of innocence in order to prepare us for a more sophisticated model of survival. And in doing so, causes itself, trillions of dollars of wasted opportunity, and reduces the well-being of the cult by 95%. and isn't accountable for that waste of human resource, that waste of energy. And it's very, very sad to watch that on a mathematical level, because you have a series of paradigms and beliefs that turn reality upside down and send people in the exact opposite direction of grace and well-being, while pretending to be mature and sophisticated, and having blinders and lenses that obscure the easy opportunities along the way. And so this is kind of one of the biggest things, how to bring these energies together. It's quite a paradoxical thing. And within the chauvinism of the cult, that more innocent face is more feminine and is automatically boycotted and undervalued. I deal with that partly by talking in the language of cynicism, partly by developing articulating talent, partly by, I guess, having a counter bias, meaning people reject me all the time for choosing happiness over normalcy, and I reject people all the time for choosing normalcy over happiness. And so those forces kind of meet, and there's a tension and a bit of an invitation to wake up in that domain. In the dimension of challenges, there's a number of challenges that make this whole journey more difficult for me and in relationship with other people. One is counterphobic fear. Kind of the need to face that which is most terrifying, to confront the pink elephant in the room, etc. And so this often puts me in the sense of kind of this tight controversy where the sensitive part in me wants nothing to do with it, but the counterphobic part wants it to become conscious. The counterphobic part in me senses the discrepancies in the mathematics of the cult and wants to bring light on them by bringing friction. Says, no, this isn't true. This math, it doesn't work. And if we shake it enough, this structure will fall apart because the underlying engineering is weak. And since everyone else is tiptoeing around the weak areas of the structure to protect the system, I guess I will become the disruptor in order to show how it falls apart. This is a very difficult role for sensitive, and it's the kind of polar opposite. It's kind of the part of me that empathizes with, the larger system and structure, wants to create safety by good engineering. But I'm in a cult of denial that every time I say there's a problem here, it says, don't talk about that, we're busy, don't do this, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. And I'm saying it's not fine. They say, stop talking about that. And so I shake at it. And then I get blamed for when the pieces fall apart, and there isn't really a very conscious role. It's kind of semi-conscious on my part, it's semi-conscious on other people's part. But the easiest way through this, the path of grace, is for people to be interested in the weaknesses that I analyze and to participate together in making it stronger without a lot of disruption. It's just that doesn't happen very, very easily. And so there's a lot of awkwardness and stress and stuff, stuff along those lines. There's also fear around beliefs, meaning the amount of childhood trauma that I've experienced, the amount of rejection and fear and, being hit. Being hit is one of the hardest things that I've dealt with as a human being. It's very, very hard to be in my body, being hit by someone I desperately want to love me. And that's the child, the abusive child in so many of our parental families. Unable to be in my body and feel that. There's a dissociation, there's a trauma, there's elements of PTSD, there's grief that can't fully be felt because I'm not in my body to feel it. There's a lot of fear of that pain, and with that fear comes this deep internal divide between the part of me that's trying to face things and counterphobically, confront that which is fearing me, and the part of me that is in grief and terror and desperation to separate. And how am I dealing with this? I think mostly just, on an ongoing path of integration and also meditation, working with the channel Lazarus, working with the channel Seth, working with, a Thai healer that works a lot with these transcendent states, working with forgiveness, having the courage to go into these dark places of our cult with someone by my side, because it's too much for the child-like part of me to go in there alone. And these are not within the cult's landscape of vocabulary. These are terrains that to go into them is to go into them as a 1% of 1%. And, although we all journey in there in our dreams, there's very few people that will take this into the mundane vocabulary of a relationship to be there together. And so that's a big part of the crisis that I'm dealing with, is how to find, human beings able and capable of navigating this terrain with the level of empathy and love that makes it honorable to discuss and go there. And to a certain extent, it's not honorable, meaning it's not respectful of that sacredness to discuss that on a video of this nature, where the majority of people by a huge margin are dealing with this as a kind of an abstract, impatient, kind of ephemeral relationship with something that they're not deeply connected to in their own body and their own feelings, and would not honor within their paradigm, even if they could put it into words, because they don't have a paradigm that honors this terrain in the psyche. Asperger's and regulation is another crisis, because with shock and dissociation emotionally with both parents, there's a tremendous amount of grief, tremendous amount of sleep and unconsciousness, of numbing, of pain that's just way too big for an infant to deal with. There's also the insanity of unregulated parents out of touch with their own feelings, and the grasping to the certainty of mathematics and objects, which is one of the Asperger's type expressions. Basically, it's in essence saying my parents are too volatile and violent to form secure attached relationships with, and so I will form a relationship with a stapler, because the stapler doesn't get mad, and the stapler doesn't hate, and the stapler works repetitively in a very satisfying way, to the part that's saying, oh, thank goodness, there's part of this ecology that is sane. It just does, it's so wonderful. It does it, and then it does it, and it does it, and it's like the fascination with things in a repetitive things, trying to answer as a child, as an infant, the need for secure attachment with a few repetitive things as opposed to a few stable and secure human beings. And again, the tremendous loss by not being able to have a secure attached relationship with both parents, emphasizing the feminine, because the external was so nice, and the labels were so nice, but the feelings were so terrifying. And we have then the insecure attachment dynamic with a lack of regulation, resulting in kind of an on or an off switch with people. It's very difficult for me to mediate in between. A professional container helps a lot with that, and so I tend to be able to regulate with my clients. But with friends or lovers, it tends to be all on or all off. And since I don't like to impose myself, I generally switch to off if I don't meet with someone who's all on about me very rapidly. And so that again limits me down to around 3% of the population who is delighted and clear and sees the essence of me and enough to be all on within a few hours. And then it's like, yes. And then that becomes that zoom in, high focus lens that can be very magical, but, very little room for anyone else in the relationship. And it creates a certain amount of jealousy with lovers that, if I'm lovers with someone and I switch my zoom lens from them to, someone else, I completely ignore, them, and I'm there with the other person. Since very few people allow me to be all that I am, in the relationship, it's just a reality that I express different sides of myself with different people, and so I will laugh 3 times more with this person. I will have deep conversations 3 times more with this person. I will explore transcendent, sacred, and ecstatic sexuality with this person. I will explore nurturing cuddle and touch and play with this person. They don't all fit into one person in my experience. And so whoever I'm with in that zoom in lens, there is an awareness of, and sometimes a frustration of, the unexpressed potential within my personality, which when I had an open relationship with 8 people for a few weeks of time, I got to express almost all of it within the 2-week period. So there was the transcendent, the 8-hour phone conversations, the playful gift giving, the dancing, the transcendent sexuality, the playful adolescent, the enjoyment in activities, the detached conversations, all fitting very nicely within those, and the joy of cooking, and the whole thing was a very beautiful montage. And yet none of these people got to meet the other parts of me in the other relationship, because they're meeting that part, and I'm following the punishment reward cycle offered in that relationship, and finding the part of me that is in integrity with myself, but is also pleasing, to that person, to express that. I never lie, I never cheat, I never withhold. That's a part of kind of core personality. And I always enjoy kind of doing what I think is best for the other. But there's very, very different sides of me, and I've never really kind of found the right way to navigate through all of those parts within what is an insecure attachment, one could say a disorder, of kind of an all-on, all-off response. Then more recently, with therapeutic abuse under the influence of psychedelics, developing into a denial-shame dynamic, with the Human Awareness Institute and their facilitator body and board of directors, which deeply, deeply hurt the child, that magical part that offered a way here and a way here and a way here, and was, shut out and silenced and, lied to and blockaded to a point where it's one of the deepest wounds in my life. A deep grief, understanding, that that's a reenactment of this lifetime's wound, in which I'm not seen and understood and loved in so many arenas by so many people that don't have the lenses to engage with grace, leading to PTSD. And this is a very difficult thing to find within me. The explosive rages, the explosive griefs and disoriented energy as certain things became more insane. There's a lot of my psyche that doesn't have a home in our cult. And the risk of any invisible energy is that it becomes highly unregulated to a point that one cannot track it. So I've done a lot of work personally in meditation and journals, etc., to track that energy that is otherwise not being tracked. And yeah, and so that's a big grief and crisis, and has further escalated the need for feminine and heart energy, while simultaneously putting me in conflict with a culture that does not respond to the challenge, which has I've responded to mostly by loving that part in another who's become my wife, and connecting in that childlike, loving energy which we both share deeply. And again, doing some work with a healer that has been able to connect at a deep enough level with source energy as to not be phased by the inadequacy of other people, to honor that grace in her. This is incredibly aspirational and impressive in my eyes. And so there comes the feminine, bias where, to my eyes, this Thai healer is probably the most important and enlightened person that I know on the planet, because she's found a way to love and connect with this innocence that transcends the severe abuse that has been directed to her. And I haven't learned that. And it is a transcendent pivot point, in my lifetime, were I to do so, were I to reach her level of grace and healing. I've worked with 40 healers before she came into my life through a back door of an ex-lover who happened to do some trauma work. Then also this zoom-in lens makes it very difficult to connect with groups. Some of that is that zoom-in lens and the interest in the details of what is going on means that I take up about 30% of the space in a group, because I want to know what this and what about that and this. But, if we count the amount of interest shown in a group of 50 people, I might account for 30% of it, until a certain amount of hostility, the general group feeling like you're invading the group takes in. But truly, I want to see at a level of excellence what's going on in that group. And it's in service of that group dynamic, or it's certainly in service of wanting to connect with that comes up. So my response is simply to avoid groups, rather than be resented by a third of the group, ambivalent by a third of the group, and highly enjoyed by a third of the group. But that's 2/3 in an ambivalent to hostile relationship with this structure of engaging with groups. Whereas if I'm one-on-one, of course, the expectation is that we'll each take up 50% of the energy, which is consistent with that zoom-in lens. But this is also a disability, because it has left me a loner in many areas, simply because I lack the regulating ability to be a kind of a balanced team player, so to speak. And I fear being ganged up on by the group who is not capable of understanding what the cards I've been given and what I have to do with them. This is always a certain area of anger and loneliness, that a whole host of things get projected onto me that are not checked out, based on the assumption that I am like other people, which is not checked out. And based on those two faulty assumptions, a variety of agendas are projected onto me which are not checked out. And then I'm reacted to as if those agendas were an accurate assessment of me, as opposed to a series of assumptions and stuff. And I haven't yet to find the individual who has, A, the humility to unpack those projections, or if they do, is correct in them. And so it is, there's some fear and pain and sense of desperation that in this context, nobody sees me. And so I've responded to that mostly by one-on-one interaction, one, and two, culture building, where we walk through the engineering of paradigm, of intention, and of protocol in the relationship, and walk through the mapping of both people, so that we say, this is what I do and this is why I do it. For example, this is an example of this. If you are intelligent, you cannot come away with this without more awareness and thus more respect for certain terrains within me that would allow us to connect more empathically. And there's also a certain gift in there for me, in that impatient people who do not want to understand this tend to be high on the sociopathic continuum when it comes to interacting in these terrains. And so it's a self-selecting filter. If you can make it through this video and be able to track it and talk about it and be excited to talk about it, you're in terms of being in a 5% pool, of individuals that are likely to connect in these areas of continuum. And so that's a lot of what I do, is kind of very lightly brushstroke, put these filters out there, watch how people interact with the filters, and then select, out of 1,000 people, maybe 1-2 people that graciously and happily find their way, through these various mazes and into the center garden with, where have you been? Let's connect around this. And this is challenging primarily because of the numbers game, and because I'd like to be a very direct person. I'd like to just lay this out and have people just say yes, no, but there's a lot of offense, because the suggestion, if I lay something like this out very explicitly, the suggestion is that somehow it is superior. But it is not necessarily superior, but it is distinct and needs to be honored, just like you are distinct and need to be honored. If you have a set point where you're most comfortable is a zoom in with 3 people, and being deep one-on-one with one person just feels a little too intense, that set point, even if everything else is simpatico, is going to create friction of constant intensity and overwhelm for you, whereas constant diffusion for me. And so these are things that need to be understood, not because there are right or wrong Zoom settings, but certain Zoom settings are good for certain things. We cannot always change our Zoom setting, and we need to be, sensitive to the Zoom settings. So I avoid groups and create more conscious cultures and navigate through videos like this. And I'm very grateful when another human being does the same. That's very rare to find, so I lead. Meaning I lead in doing a video like this and see if there's a response, because no one has ever given me a video like this, or a book like this, or here's how you connect with me, and not like this, and not like this, and tell me about you. No one's ever presented that doorway, but it is a very powerful doorway, and so I offer it and take it as far as someone will allow me to take it. Innovative, on the normalcy continuum, I'm very, very high on the innovative. The way that I express that is choosing happiness over normalcy. And so my response is to use kind of a first principles physics assessment of, here's pain. These are the algorithms that cause pain. These are the misconception and cultural norms that lead to this statistic of pain within our cult. Now, I don't want pain. I don't want to see you in pain. So how would we have to engineer that so that that pain goes away? And let's work as friends and allies to do that. This is, it immediately takes one outside the cult, because the culture is not interested in your and my well-being. It's interested in maintaining a status quo, in a fear-based, shame-based sense of normalcy, and no, we shouldn't rock the boat. But this is a very, very different part. Like, if you want to do this and this and this, that's great. And so I'm way up in kind of the top 1 to 5% in terms of ongoing innovation and around the moment. And this creates a lot of cultural misunderstanding, and it's a tragedy in some ways, because if you're looking through the lens of the cult and you say that normal is safe, that's the default, and so you're doing it normally, so you're safe. If you look purely through that lens and not through an engineering lens, you will feel safe doing highly dysfunctional things that everyone is doing and that preclude great reservoirs of happiness. If you look through an engineering lens, and for example, you see someone start to shake, well, one of the first things you might do is hug them very tight in a bear hug, breathe with them, and shake them at the level of the intensity of their shaking. This will make them aware of their feelings. It will provide a container of the feelings, and then you can both be present with an intense amount of maybe a traumatic release. This is not normal. It just works 10 times better than saying, "May I get you a glass of water? Oh, well, would you excuse me? Perhaps I'd like to go." Or letting you say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I had feelings in your presence. Let me go." The disgusting chauvinistic apology for these feelings, as opposed to responding to them. These things will take someone into the unknown. They will realize that they cannot count on me to see things the way everyone else in their life sees them and behave the way everyone else sees them, and this puts me in a very small select group of people, usually over 50 years old in the United States, who are secure enough in themselves to venture into the unknown and do not depend on the cult for a sense of certainty, a sense of safety. This is very, very difficult for me because people get violently scared when they go into the unknown if they're not ready to hold container for themselves, and depend on the cult to do that by providing guidance, norms, however dysfunctional. And that puts me in a terrain where I connect very well with usually people in the 50 to 65-year-old, more feminine, more self-aware, open to kind of a larger sense of transcendent culture. And these minorities of people greatly appreciate me. And so I try and gravitate towards them because I like to be appreciated and I don't like scaring people. But it is absolutely miserable for me to watch people in high levels of pain and dysfunction and respond in a way that is normal and that will do very little to remedy the situation. There is a deep urgency for me in the response out of the empathy of the sensitive. And our culture is so arrogant in a certain way that most of what I'm saying there is no space for, because it doesn't occur to anyone that there would be all of this to say in that space. So there is a violation of this space with the busyness and the addictive assumption that this terrain doesn't exist, which is then, which is then, it's dealt with. It's dealt with by bulldozing over this terrain. and I don't like pushing. But there are very, very, very few people. I would say 1 in 1,000 gives me the gracious opportunity to fill the space with this information. This is one of my greatest griefs, not wanting to push and being given no space to illuminate these distinctions within any relationship, but which, if you illuminate them in any relationship, you will find people like me that are on strong minority points on continuums at the opposite poles to most of the culture, which provide unique opportunities to step into the landscape of the unknown, and with that breakthroughs that are not available with other settings in these continuums. So I'm high in the innovative continuum, which is the what's going on there, how do we respond? And examples of that might be, I noticed a regressed lover I was getting to know, and she was around 2 years old or whatever, and so she was nervous, and so I encouraged her to suck her thumb, which is 2-year-olds, and I joined her in that. And from that terrain, there was a more stable relaxation, etc., in the body, and we could play. And she was someone who, for example, wasn't terribly worried about looking normal and didn't look normal, which also puts me in the ability of being able to connect with special needs children and special needs individuals, and people high on psychedelics and people in transcendent states far more than maybe 90+% of the population, because when they're all transcending the culture, and when you transcend the culture, the only thing you want is effectiveness. And so being high on the innovative and transcendent cultural continuum makes you incredibly versatile in connecting with different spectrums of energy and different in different situations. And that's also an underdeveloped area. For example, the special needs children usually have conventional parents who are problematic because they are worried about diverging from the norms. And so, every time I've tried to connect with the special needs of a child, the ignorance and fear of the parent has left me as a perceived enemy, and I don't want to be in that role in a cult that protects the parent more than the child. And finally, a technical and mathematical formula. Some of this is the high volumes of pain and violation that have happened with my emotional and energetic body, have left me have left me needing to dissociate from the high emotional charges around those violations, but also need to communicate and navigate as best as possible within the culture. And so what I do is I take those high sensitivity, vulnerable and emotional charges, I run them through a translator into mathematics, and then I communicate the mathematics of the situation, which most people are less threatened by, and which gives me a buffer from my own feelings, which are being violated by the cult and by many situations. And I can't afford to feel the intensity of that grief and violation as it's happening. But I can talk. I once translated into mathematics, which is again an Asperger's trick. Then I can, or an Asperger's coping mechanism, an Aspie's coping mechanism, which is to translate emotions into objects. Then you can talk about the objects in objective and scientific terms, rather, they become numbers. If it's very similar to the process of, an accountant versus a sales force. The sales force deals with people's feelings. but they can be translated in a very detached way into accounting numbers. And this is both a connecting point and a dissociative point, because many of the people I most like to connect with have more versatility and more holding and container patterns, because they're not as emotionally young as I am. And so they have a greater capacity to stay connected with their own feelings, which is what attracts me to them. It's like, yes, water, beautiful water. You can be in your body and feel feelings, and I can remember what that felt like through the mirror neurons of seeing your face. It's beautiful. It's incredible. But in this, in my navigating towards tears, towards grief, towards emotion, it's a very fragile navigation for me. And I often have to do it mathematically with a lot of patience. And this is the patience and the love that is hardest to find in our culture. And so it is one of the biggest stuck points. And so I'm very aware that 65% of my life force and energy has been bound up in the mathematical illiteracy of these continuums, meaning that the fact that we as a cult do not educate each other about the continuums of relating and where we are on them, and the abstract technical pros and cons of being at each point on the continuum, and how to create recipes like a chemist predictably creating aspirin from core base elements over and over again. We don't teach this science of connecting, which is a tragedy in many ways. And because it is the biggest frustration or it's a disconnect point for me in many ways with human beings, my response to that is to write a book like Co-Creating Conscious Chemistry, to illustrate perhaps 20% of these terrains, perhaps more, to create again videos that create for me a landscape of mathematics around relating that that allow me to begin to empathize with the little one who is in the prison, in the harness of this cult, in this body, in this place, in a lot of fear and a lot of nightmares, terrified, out of his wits, and wanting to come back home, wanting to come back into, to love and intimacy and connection, and the traps which we've stepped into a little bit in this video is the hurt and frustration and impatience and helplessness created by the invisibility of these terrains, migrating from grief and from the joy of exploring this landscape into the bitterness and the cynicism of arrogance. You fucked up peons can't grasp these most basic tenets, and that's something I very much understand and empathize with my adolescent, because it's absolute hell, growing up in this framework, and it's so painful and it's so frustrating. The level of sociopathic ignorance around that level of pain and the refusal to hear and to respond is excruciating. At the same time, it does not help me because I am in a world where 1% of people really have the time, the space, the capacity, the empathy to grasp a lot of this and respond. And for many, it's quite an effort to do so and quite a generosity. They're doing it for me. And when they're doing it, at a level that's frustratingly incomplete, to zing them with my arrogance and my hostility and hurt, of course, doesn't work. What's generally worked in our culture is for me to endure about 5 to 10 times more invisible pain than the other person is aware of, long enough for them to get to know me while hurting me. So that they have time at their speed to develop empathy and understanding, so that by the time that they understand that they have been hurting me 5 to 10 times more than they understood and in ways they didn't understand, so that by that time they actually give a damn, and they apologize for hurting me and stop hurting me. And then I reached a break point after observing that it took up to 6 months for that process to take place, in which I was in very high levels of pain. And so I just started going overseas, where it was 10 times easier in Philippines and Thailand to navigate into some of these landscapes, particularly Thai culture, which is just so admirable to me. The smiling, the empathy, all the temples, the focus on on accepting people the way they are is just so magnificently sophisticated as a culture. That screw the intellect. These people have the real deal in many levels. So this is my landscape, my life challenge, my prison, my grief, my greatest fear, wanting to connect and running up into these statistics of learning by now just how rare it is to find that person who can love me in this terrain, and who I can make happy. That's the key thing. It's such a joy, and it's my greatest accomplishment is bringing that joy to my wife. And loving all the parts of her that are not normal but are magnificent. The continuums of connection, the challenges, and some of the doorways.